Hi, and welcome to the IndieCade Twitch channel. Today, we're doing a special episode in conjunction with the festival that will be starting this week. And I'm really excited because we're going to be giving our Game Changer Award this year to Dr. Morgan Romine, who I've known for a number of years. And I'm Celia Pearce. I'm the co-founder of IndieCade, and we're going to talk a little bit about Morgan's work in the game industry and what she's contributed to diversity and inclusion and other things. And so I think we'll just get started. So Morgan, it's so great to see you and so great to have you. And thank you for putting aside the time to do this. I know you're super busy. And I was really happy when Stephanie was like, do you want to interview Morgan? I'm like, you bet I do. Because we actually have a lot of shared interests and also some overlapping people that we've worked with. So, but I wanted to start out, one of the things that really struck me about your profile is that most of the people that I know that have been really involved in diversity and inclusion initiatives are coming from outside of industry. And you started your entire trajectory, first of all, pretty early compared to a lot of the other things that are going on now, but also from inside a major game studio. So I'd love to hear a little bit about like, how did you get from I'm a community manager at this company to I'm doing this really innovative inclusiveness initiative?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I feel like I'm sort of an original product of gaming. So definitely, like, I'm not coming from that side. I've definitely been here. I feel like I grew up within games, and through college, I played all the video games and then got a job out of that being like, I was a guild leader in MMOs, so maybe I could manage communities professionally. Maybe that's a thing I could do. And through persistence was able to get hired by Ubisoft to do that. And that's where I think you and I first met back in like 2004, I think is when I started doing that work. And so, I mean, that was all just organic. The management of community stuff was all stuff I had been doing before. And certainly I had felt like I was a little bit of an unusual presence being a woman in that space. But I didn't really think too much about it. Because I think maybe in MMOs we're a little bit more diverse than like the strict, shooter environment or fighting game environment or whatever. But when I really started to have better exposure to the industry, it became much clearer that there was a stark lack of diversity in a lot of the spaces that I was finding myself in. And so it was, through those observations, which partly started off like, well, this is just normal that there's not a lot of women here, to being like, wait a minute, not a lot of women here. Why is that? We were able to spin up the Fragdoll program and recruit women who were super competitive and kick ass to all be on kind of like an all-star team to compete. And for me, that combined a lot of other things. Like, I have a competitive sports background. I played basketball in college. So I felt like I fell right into that, like, oh yeah, I know what this is like. Like, being on a team of girls competing felt familiar to me. And it was only through being kind of that repetition of like, all these girls playing video games, that's so weird, and these girls being competitive, that's so weird, that started to grate on me a little bit. Like, I'd sort of taken it for granted before, and it really got under my skin as a thing that we needed to work on. But I was really lucky to have a team of women to take that on with me, and we saw sort of all carried that torch, and all were doing that together, and all sort of communicating proudly how much we love video games, and also not being apologetic about the fact that we were girls who also liked to dress up and like to hang out together and like to be girly in that space. Really, and it was a weird crash course in feminism for a lot of us, I think, too. It's like, I think we got a really interesting education early on. And then I decided to go back and get my PhD in anthropology, which was certainly another amazingly helpful education about the importance of diversity, culturally speaking. And so I kind of carried it on from there.
I thought it was interesting, though, that your undergraduate degree was also in anthropology, and that you kind of brought that. I don't think it's a coincidence that you brought that to the table when you came to Ubisoft, and that you had already kind of a cultural awareness that would have come from that educational background, I would think.
Yeah, it was a love that I couldn't really put down. Like I went to games because I loved games too, but I couldn't really let go of the anthropology sort of passion, and that all of the ways that cultural anthropology thinks about the world and thinks about worldviews and how people work together to do things and create the world that we live in. I just find super fascinating, and so I did go back to. I actually taught. As an undergrad at Berkeley, you're able to teach classes as a student. So I taught a decal called The Anthropology of Online Gaming Communities.
Oh my God.
Which it was, I didn't realize that was going to be a sign of all the things to come, but it was.
Yeah, I mean, it became a discipline after that, really. Yeah. I was going to also, so I have always said that I think that all online game companies should have an anthropologist on the staff.
I agree.
And so it's really interesting that Ubisoft actually did that, and also that, to me, I think community management is kind of a form of applied social science, right? You have to understand how people interact with each other in order to craft a community. And I think for me, that's also kind of where I come at it from anthropology, is like I make social spaces as well as studying them.
Right. Yeah. Well, and to think too, the more you study culture, the more you realize that it doesn't have to be an accidental, thoughtless thing that we just happen to all do these practices because other people are doing these practices. We can start to think about how you curate your cultural spaces. And then if you're mindful about the practices that you are embracing as a group, you can that can become the culture. And as a community manager, that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to make a space where everybody can participate and feel welcome and feel like they're engaged and feel like they have friends who want to play with them, and that they're always they're always getting something joyful out of that experience in these gaming community spaces. And that if you don't nurture that, then it will not be that automatically. And I think that's in the old school days, like the real Wild West eras of the online cultural spaces, we kind of were just accidentally like, it's just going to be fine, right? And then the longer it goes along, a lot of those community spaces you get toxicity that pops up in various places. So I think we are sort of in that next phase now of realizing that you can curate those spaces, and the developers themselves can curate in ways, and the community managers have their box of tools, and social media managers have their tools they can use to do that. So that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like I like your optimism. I feel like in some sectors of the industry, it's kind of too far gone to be repaired. But I think there are other sectors where it's clear that things are moving in a better direction. So that's
it's really hard when you have patterns set to change those patterns. It's a lot harder to do that than it is to be mindful in your planning stages about how to do that and set a strategy for community early on. I mean, back in the day, that was not a thing. It was always an afterthought. It was like, oh, it was more like a multiplayer thing. Oops. We have to, if that's going to be a thing.
It's like, oops, we created culture. Well, yeah, and I mean, because I've always been interested in emergent behavior, right? What I find is that once emergent behavior takes hold, you really just can't unwind it. No. And so that's why you have to get ahead of it and try to like deal with it before it happens, because once it happens, you're kind of hosed. So, so tell me a little bit about your PhD work, because I didn't ever read your dissertation, which I now realize I should have, because I'm sure it's great and it's obviously very relevant to my work. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your research, and kind of part of what intrigues me about your history is the blend of the research and the practice, and then moving into this advocacy. And I have a note here that says anthropology and as activism. So would love to just hear like about your getting your PhD and what you took away from that added to your repertoire and thinking about this kind of activist inclusiveness.
So I think, working for Ubisoft and doing what I was doing with the Fragdoll work, it was very much community focused. I was, player focused and community focused and thinking about communities more than the creation of the game as a product or game design as a process.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wanted to see that side of things. I thought that was sort of, it seemed like I would be able to answer a lot of questions about how community cultures emerged in these gaming spaces that are so heavily influenced by what the game itself is presenting. The lessons that a game designer puts into their game, the affordances in the game structure and code itself. So I was able to do my work with an independent game studio. I was working for them at the same time as their esports manager, and we were developing features for their esports aspect of their game. So I got to actually be kind of part of the design team that taught me a lot about those processes and the culture within the studios themselves, to be able to really sort of unpack how the culture within a studio and the ways that those developers are interacting reverberates in what emerges in the community spaces themselves. They're really, they feed one another. You get a cycle, and in game design, the people in game design are very much gamers. They're very much actively playing other games as they're making games. So you have this whole sort of process that feeds itself, and you perpetuate certain patterns because they're like, I was playing this game that had this awesome feature that we totally need to include in our game because we think it would, do whatever. And then you have the expectations of the players themselves. And certainly, like the time that I was there was during the closed beta and open beta parts of the game release process. And so you're also dealing a lot with player expectation. What you tell them the game is going to be colors how they then interact with the game that they're playing. It was really an amazing experience and opportunity to get to see and not only see behind the scenes, but be able to participate in that process. It taught me a lot about the importance of game design and how code is not neutral. How people make games and people make software, and people are behind the code, and the values and beliefs and experiences of the people absolutely shape that code that then other people interact with, which is really kind of an important lesson, I feel like.
It's funny because my Communities of Playbook, one of the things that I was which is based on my dissertation, was at the time that I was writing, there weren't any designers doing anthropology in games. And I was very obsessed with what you just said. How are the affordances of the software contributing to this kind of behavior? And one of my master students at Georgia Tech, he was very interested in Uru and the mist properties that I studied. And so he did his master's thesis, and I got to hook him up with Cyan, and he actually went to their studios. And his hypothesis was exactly what you were just saying, that the values of the studio are going to be reflected in the emergent behavior of the players. Okay. And indeed, he was correct. And he was telling me how they showed him like some of the original concept books and the marketing documents, and how eerie it was, how much they lined up with what the final player population was and what their what their behavior patterns were and so forth. So yeah, I think we have to realize that game design is a sort of a form of social engineering.
Absolutely. Well, right.
Whether
and so
you think of it that way is not.
You think about that in the diversity, inclusion, and equity lens, and you think about how there's this direct relationship between the people who are making the games and the people who play the games. If you're not actively trying to diversify that, there will just be sort of an automatic mirroring. And in the studio that I was in, I was, out of 150 people, I think 10 of us were women. And like that comes out in the game, whether you mean it to or not. And that is shown in the culture, in the practices within the studio themselves. And so it really I think underscores the importance of thinking about diversity and inclusion and equity on all of these fronts. It can't just be a matter of let's make our marketing more diverse and look more inclusive, or let's like reach out to player audiences that we're not speaking to. You really need to be thinking about it also from the game development side of things and making sure.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of research now, and when we were doing Ludica back in the mid 2000s, we wrote about this, that there's more research now that shows that the more women you have on your team, the more appealing your game will be to women. So from a business perspective, this is not new. Everyone says, oh, it's good business to be diverse, but you're basically doubling your audience if you have more women in your studio.
Yep.
So what are you working on now? Is there anything like, I don't know, I know you have a company, so tell us a little bit about the nonprofit and about what kinds of initiatives you're doing there, and if there's anything super exciting that's coming down the pike. I'd love to hear about it.
So IndieCade is awesome because I got to found it with TL Taylor. And so really, we really established our roots in the robust academic research tactics and strategy. Like we are research driven 100%, which is really refreshing because we're not coming from the marketing side of like, what metrics do we need to hit? It's like we're doing the actual research, the social science research in these spaces to try to understand what are the cultural barriers that are preventing more women and people of color and queer folk from feeling welcome in a lot of these spaces. So studying those issues first, and then from that research, we're then able to extract some ideas and hypotheses and strategies about things that might help to break down some of those barriers. We craft initiatives then around those different strategies and ideas from the research. And we really have done a lot of different things. It's a lot of throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, because you don't actually know what's necessarily going to work. But we've got to do some cool stuff in the esports space around gender inclusive tournaments. So like we've done a lot in the Counter-Strike women's scene, trying to help make sure that their tournaments are more inclusive and run correctly and run professionally, and really supporting those players as part of the pipeline to getting them to the final stages of ultimately being able to compete in like the big event tournaments. Collegiate esports a lot. We've done a lot of training around if you have an esports club on a college campus, for example, how can you make your space more inclusive? How can you make it not only more welcoming to invite people in, but then have policies and procedures in place so that if somebody is uncomfortable for some reason, you have a way to handle it and know what to do, instead of just being caught flat-footed, like, oh no, somebody feels like they're being harassed by somebody, what do you do? And there are a lot of clubs and officers and varsity teams even who have run into situations where they have a minority of women who want to participate, and they're not sure how to make sure that they feel comfortable. And then also the women don't want to feel like they're being coddled too hard either. So it's this fine balance. And we try to walk them through some of the best practices around that. And really, I feel like we've been able to sort of tackle some of these things on various different fronts. We work with affiliates who stream on Twitch, who are representative of everybody you would want to see in gaming, and trying to help them support their communities and thrive and succeed. So yeah, I mean, IndieCade is cool because we are a nonprofit. We usually work with corporations to sponsor a lot of these initiatives, thankfully, and then we get our research funded sneakily, like through those initiatives. We're like, we'll do that initiative for you, but we have to do the research first, because research is hard.
Yeah, and that really answers my question too about anthropology as activism, right? Because you're using it. And I mean, I also find that like when I talk about diversity, I like to come armed with data.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm curious about this because it's something that I'm working on, and I'd love to hear your take on it. So my university is starting to build an initiative around older gamers. And one thing I stumbled onto was, do you know this team, the Silver Snipers?
I think I have heard of this. Yeah,
it's a senior esports team that kicks ass. They like beat everybody. They're really good.
Mhm.
But I found this really interesting data point that I put in the deck, which is that according to the World Health Organization, half of all people in the world are biased against older people. Half of the entire planet. And I was like, I kept like, how is that possible? But yeah, it seems really weird. But I mean, it's the World Health Organization. They do a lot of research. And so
Mm.
I was wondering, what if you have any thoughts about ageism, if that's come up at all in your inclusiveness work, or where
Yeah.
it kind of intersects with other forms.
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah. You just blew my mind because I just there's all sorts of cultural, like really fascinating things about, how different cultures handle their elders and have familial piety and respect for older generations. And if you overlap that with various gaming populations, and then overlap that with I think a lot of perceptions held by older generations who maybe didn't grow up with games, where they tend to be biased against them. And so you get this generational tension where it's like,
yeah,
well, they're old people because they don't like my video games anyway. You get a lot of really interesting sort of patterns there, but certainly ageism is a thing. You see it on Twitch all the time, and there have been some amazing 40 and up. I love saying in the gaming space that if you're older than 40, then you're part of that group that might have ageism. You might be dealing with ageism. But there are streamers who are 50, 60, 70s, and they're streaming, which I think is amazing and awesome, and they haven't really gotten so much pickup, but a few of them have built some really amazing communities where people are happy to support them and cheer for them, and then try to encourage their own grandparents or parents to play with them. So that seems to be something that's sort of emerging. I don't know, I think the Zoomers might actually be more open to supporting older folks than maybe the millennials were. I don't know. But that's the thing we run into.
Yeah. When I did research into baby boomer gamers back in 2006, and one of my findings was that, and I don't know if this is still the case, but at the time it was more common for grandchildren, for grandparents to be playing with their grandchildren than for parents to be playing with their kids.
Yeah, interesting.
And I've been hearing a lot of stories. I just have been hearing a couple stories lately from people who have friends who play, older women who play Minecraft with their grandchildren. So I think there's some really interesting stuff going on in this space. Let me see. I'm going to think if there's anything else, because this is kind of a shortish interview. Is there anything else you want to talk about that you're excited about or that you're interested in, or?
Well, yeah, I think one thing that we've been working on for the last couple of years, my current co-director and I, Dr. Johanna Brewer, who is a computer science professor at Smith College, they started as a postdoc with TL and then stepped into our director of research role. And the amazing thing about having Johanna on our team is that Johanna is a computer scientist and can build us awesome tools to play with. And so we were able to build our GLHF platform, which is people can sign a pledge that it's like 7 different promises, basically to try to not be a jerk online, try to be respectful of other people. I will try to not get tilted. I will try to take a step back if somebody says something I'm doing is hurtful. Like, these basic things that you really don't ever see these things in gaming spaces, or at least very rarely. Certainly back in the day, we didn't see them. And I think that some spaces are becoming better about putting codes of conduct and rules in place that show people like, no, actually we like to be supportive of one another. But this is a sort of generalized set of promises. And if you sign this pledge, then you can also get an exclusive badge, a global badge on Twitch that says, I signed the pledge. You get your little...
Oh, nice.
People love Flair, so that's a motivation by itself. But then there's also folks who really are proud of being able to show, I am in this space and I'm trying to be a positive contributing member of this space. We have 1.5 million people who have signed this thing.
Oh, that's great.
For this type of initiative is pretty wild. And Johanna and I actually we published a paper about it last year about inclusive design on social platforms. And we're hoping to continue to iterate on that and learn more and see if we can turn it into an opportunity to reach out to folks who are maybe not living up to the pledge, because there's a way to report people. So if somebody's in your stream and they're acting bad and they have the little any key GLHF badge, you can report them for not holding up the promises, and we can then reach out to them and we can say, hey, somebody's reported you for this. You might want to remember to, not do the thing that you were doing. Those comments were creepy. I don't know. The streamer thought that was a little bit inappropriate.
Yeah.
And a lot of people actually are really responsive to that kind of feedback. Like in a private environment, they get an email that says, hey, you need to remember to try to stick to the pledge. And actually, it's amazing how many folks are like, you're right, I got tilted. I was having a bad day. I'll try to be better. Or they'll just say, like, I didn't realize that thing that I was doing was toxic or being perceived that way. And so we're really excited about that sort of learning potential of creating learning moments through a tool like that. It's pretty exciting.
This is great because, first of all, for our viewers, might you tell them where they might be able to sign up for this pledge?
Well, so our website is anykey.org, and you'll see the GLHF. It's impossible to say, but you all should.
What does it stand for?
It stands for Good Luck, Have Fun, which you see in lots of esports competitions, folks typing out GLHF to each other. It's a wonderful symbol of goodwill and good sportspersonship in esports. So that's the way we try to harness that energy. And the pledge is on there. You can sign the pledge. And you can read all about it. We also have a bunch of resources online if you want to learn more and make your own spaces more inclusive. We're happy to help with that.
So even though I haven't done it yet, I'm gonna endorse this for a couple of reasons. And one is that, we all know that games have codes of conduct buried in their 20-page terms of service that nobody ever reads.
Exactly.
And so but the other thing is that in my research, one of the things that I've found was that social enforcement is a much, much better tool than any other kind of enforcement mechanism. And in the Uru group that I studied, they only ever had a single instance of griefing, and it was dealt with within the community. They didn't even report it to the game masters. They just kicked the guy out. It was a 10-year-old boy in a group that was mostly women and mostly baby boomers. And they were like, no, you're out. End of story. And I also wanted to say, I really like that private intervention, because one thing I've noticed is that people tend to really like to just air their grievances on social media, but not have direct interaction with the person. Like I had this happen to me recently. I did something that I could have done better. And the person, fortunately, they didn't mention my name, but like we could have had a productive conversation between us. And I mean, I took note and I understood what I had done wrong, but we didn't have a kind of an opportunity to build any kind of healing process after that. It was just, I've written you off. That's what he said in the email. I've written you off. And then he posted, I've written this person off. And meanwhile, I'm trying to be better, and I will anyway, whether you've written me off or not. I will do everything I can. But, and then conversely, like I remember at a conference a couple of years ago, I called someone out on what I thought was kind of a racist. It was a situation where we were talking about certain types of pervasive games, and an African-American male was saying, I can't run around being chased on the street in a game because I might get shot. And this person, who was a very well-intentioned young woman, said, well, then you shouldn't play this kind of game. And needless to say, I had a complete hissy fit. And then she came up to me afterwards and was like, worried that I was going to post on social media. And I said, no, I already told you what I thought, and you learned your lesson. Like I don't have to say anything more about it.
Yeah.
I find a lot of times, and this has been true with IndieCade because we've been very proactive about inclusiveness, is that really just calling it to somebody's attention is all that needs to happen for most people. Yeah. A percentage of people will be obnoxious about it, but most people really just want to be good, and they just don't know. And if you just say, hey, you should have included some female artists in your talk about art and games or something like that, I mean, some of some of the strongest sort of allies and inclusiveness advocates in the IndieCade community got that way from being part of the IndieCade community and being interacting with other people that help them.
Right.
I love that approach.
Yeah. Yeah. Because social media, I mean, it's an amazingly powerful and important tool for being able to speak truth to power. So if you're not in a position where you can actually speak to somebody because there's too much of a power differential or maybe a safety issue where you don't feel safe talking to them, great. Social media, it can be really powerful for that kind of call out. But I have also seen over the last few years it being used more broadly to just air grievances, like you were saying, and instead of having that opportunity to be able to call in with someone and being able to, even if it's mediated, sometimes you need somebody else there, a third party person, to be able to mediate and see both sides and support both folks for whatever that learning moment is going to be. But sometimes just be sending somebody a heartfelt, like, hey, this made me feel really uncomfortable. I wanted you to know because I want you to be able to be better about that. Because you're right, most people do want to be better. We don't always know how to. We're not, not everybody is good about researching all the ways to do that. But the first step is to be accepting of feedback. And if you give that feedback directly to them in a respectful way, often that will be received and can actually be productive.
I love that term you just said, call in instead of call out. I love that because it's also a way of inviting someone in instead of pushing them away, right? The other thing I really like about the pledge is that people need instructions. Like I wrote a chapter for the last Barbie Mortal Kombat book about this, 10 steps to inclusiveness. And it's really just inclusiveness for dummies. That's the basic idea of the article. Because I figure, people just need to know it's not that hard once you know what to do,
That's what a lot of our stuff with IndieCade, honestly, I think some of our most helpful interventions have been best practice guidelines of, just not just telling you the spirit of you need to be more inclusive. I think a lot of people have bought into that intention at this point, but giving them actual blueprints about how to do that is really, really helpful. Because even if it doesn't directly apply to a specific situation they might be in, it kickstarts that sort of thinking about, like, oh yeah, I can see how maybe that would be a better way of approaching it, or a good way to support someone, or a good way to make my space less potentially toxic. Just having it really spelled out for people, super helpful. We love to do that.
Yeah, and I think a common critique that goes back to like Simone de Beauvoir and the early feminists before her was that if you're not a marginalized person, then you have the luxury not to think about these things, right? Men don't have to think about gender because it's not hammered over their head day in and day out.
Yeah.
And people of color, white people don't have to think about racism because we're not victimized by it at the same rate that, so I think it's a sort of a mindfulness, right? You mentioned that early on, you used that term early on. And I think that's a really nice way to think about it is mindful. And also the curation aspect, which, obviously is something Lee Alexander wrote about it in the beginning of Gamergate, that, we have a responsibility to curate the spaces that we're creating. So
yeah, 100%.
Great. Very cool. Well, it's just been great talking to you. How do you feel about winning the Game Changer Award?
I mean, I'm deeply, deeply honored. I feel I've been blown away. I'm blown away by that because I feel like the last few years have been sort of rough. I mean, ever since Gamergate, now that you brought it up, I mean, it has felt like a harder slog than it was before, honestly. Because I do feel like, I've been doing this type of work for 20 years almost.
20 years, yeah.
And there is an impatient part of me that really wishes that we were farther along. And so this means a lot to me because I do feel like maybe this is a sign that we're going somewhere, that we are making progress, even if it is slow.
I also feel like, part of why we implemented this award was because we saw people that were really making a difference, making sacrifices, doing big initiatives that really were making a change and not really having a way to be acknowledged or honored.
Yeah.
And so we created that award specifically to say, hey, if you're doing inclusiveness, or if you're changing the game for people in some way or another, then we want to let you know that we appreciate it. So it's great. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
everything that you do, and for accepting the award. And yeah, we'll see you at the award ceremony on Saturday.
I'm excited. Thank you so much, Celia.
Thank you.